Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our celebration of Constitution Day 2014. September 7th, 1787 was the date that the Constitution was drafted. We come together today, 227 years later, to celebrate this great document and the things that it does for us as citizens of the United States. We put together a really good panel today, and it gives us an opportunity to not only address the issues of Constitution Day and broader constitutional protections and freedoms, but also kick off what's going to be an exciting year for us here at Fitchburg State University with our first common community read featuring the book, The New Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow features a lot of issues that touch on constitutional implications, and we put together a really great panel who will give us some interesting insights in that. We'll let each of them speak. We're going to hopefully have lots of good interaction with the audience, and then we'll have a nice reception afterwards as we go forward. We are still waiting for one more panelist. He's en route, but I don't want to hold this up any longer, so we're going to get started, and he'll join the conversation when we do. So let me introduce you to who we do have here. And then hopefully by then he'll be here and we'll be able to finish up. So the first person here at the table is Eric Boehme. Eric is an assistant professor of political science here at Fitchburg State University. He teaches American politics, constitutional law, and race relations classes, and he's also the coach of the award-winning Fitchburg State University Moot Court team. Dr. Boehme earned his bachelor's degree from DePaul University in Chicago, an MA and PhD from Rutgers University, which is the State University of New Jersey. He's been teaching at Fitchburg State now in his second year and has experience teaching at both private and liberal arts colleges and state universities. He is a real expert on race relations, has published a number of books on books and articles on political theory, social movements, and race relations. To his left is Michael Grant. Mr. Grant is the Assistant Deputy Commissioner of the Southern Sector of the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, where he has been employed since 1987. He began his career, as a corrections counselor, and since then has held a number of positions across varying security levels. In 1990, he was promoted to Deputy Superintendent for the Northeastern Correctional Center, then Chief Administrative Officer for the Northeastern Correctional Center. He was named Deputy Superintendent for MCI Norfolk in 1991, Superintendent at MCI Longwood in 1994, to the Southeastern Correctional Center in 2000, MCI Concord in 2002, Director of Staff Recruitment in 2006, Superintendent for MCI Plymouth in 2007, Superintendent for the Bay State Correctional Center in 2010, and Assistant Deputy Commissioner for the Southern Sector since 2012. So I think it's safe to say you've spent your adult life in prison and seen all that we have to offer in this fine state. We'll have some interesting perspectives. Finally, Mike Hussey here. Mike is a trial attorney with the Committee for Public Counsel Services, the Public Defender Division, since 1985, and is the attorney in charge of the Worcester office since 1994. He's tried cases in both district and superior courts and has argued cases before the appeals court. He's been on the murder list since 1992, handling some of the toughest cases that the corporation endeavors to deal with. Mr. Hussey was the 2003 recipient of the Massachusetts Bar Association's Access to Justice Award. In 2004, he was inducted into the American College of Trial Lawyers, of which he is a fellow, and was awarded the Edward Duggan Public Defender Award by the CPCS in 2006. Mr. Hussey's been a frequent lecturer and faculty member and done a number of training programs. He was a contributing author to the MCLE's Trying Murder and Homicide Cases. He presently serves as the president-elect of the Massachusetts Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and is a longtime member of the Massachusetts Citizens Against the Death Penalty. Soon to join us will be Joseph Early. Joseph Early is the Worcester County District Attorney at present, and I'm sure that keeps him busy and why he's running a little bit behind today. Following a successful legal career that included work for the Hampden District Attorney's Office, the Massachusetts Attorney General, and 17 years in private practice, Joe Early won election by a landslide to the Worcester District Attorney's Office in 2006. He was unopposed in 2010, and since the same holds true this year, I predict his re-election chances look very good. Mr. Early works with law enforcement agencies in 60 communities that make up the Middle District. He oversees a law office of more than 70 prosecutors, the operation of 11 district courts, the Superior Court, Juvenile Court, 3 6-member jury sessions, grand jury, and an appeals division. His juvenile division has reduced the wait for a trial from 4 months to 4 weeks. He has also introduced the investigative use of the grand jury and a diversion program for first-time offenders charged with misdemeanors. As you can see, we've got an awful lot of experience up here, and I think you're going to enjoy what we have to say. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Boehme, who's going to introduce the book, The New Jim Crow, and provide some context for you, and we'll look forward to this conversation. Eric?
Thank you. Good afternoon. How y'all doing? Good. I want to talk about this book, The New Jim Crow. We've been reading it last year and also this year in our community read, where together as a university we discuss and debate topics of intense interest. Let me pause for just one moment here. Today we want to talk about this important book, and we have some practitioners of the criminal justice system here to give us a sense of what's going on in the field. So as you can see, we also have copies of the book for sale from the bookstore. We've got a representative here from the bookstore if you'd like to buy copies afterward. It's called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The author is Michelle Alexander. She is an associate professor of law at Ohio State University. She's also the former director of the ACLU's Racial Justice Project, and she was a law clerk for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. Alexander's book was a New York Times bestseller and has generated a new debate about the relationship of race to the criminal justice system. And this new debate has a lot of resonances currently that we might want to think about. For instance, in Ferguson, Missouri, a couple of weeks ago, there was an unarmed black man who was killed by the police, and then folks in the community protested, and some rioted, and then there was a police response. Alexander talked specifically about that, talked specifically about some of the images that we might have seen in that protest of the armored vehicles and the well-armed police, and black folks in the community who were protesting the police. So this is obviously an important and a timely book, and we want to bring up some current events maybe to talk about whether or not we see this book as speaking to that. Now, Alexander's book argues three main points. First, she says the prison system today is what she calls a system of mass incarceration. She says it's directed at imprisoning and warehousing blacks and Latinos, specifically black and Latino men, who are caught up in the war on drugs. Second, she says the prison system acts as what she calls a new Jim Crow. Now, we know that Jim Crow was a set of structural segregation in the South where blacks and whites were separated. She says that the mass incarceration prison system acts as a kind of new Jim Crow, where those who are in the prison system, and especially those after the prison system who are in everyday life and who still face sanctions because of their status as an ex-convict, that this is a kind of new Jim Crow, a new way of segregating blacks and whites in America. Finally, she argues that in an age when we have a black president and when a lot of us might think in terms of colorblindness, that race isn't as important anymore, she says that it is important. And she says that the prison system is a way that race has adapted, she says. Alexander argues that the cumulative impact on the war of drugs has been a massive system imprisoning mostly men of color. And she points to the rise of the new Jim Crow through the get tough on crime policies of the 1970s. She traces this to Richard Nixon and some of the backlash against the civil rights and the anti-war protesters in the 60s. She says that though law and order policies and get tough on crime policies seem to be colorblind, she says they're actually not. That the impact that we see in black and Latino communities shows us that these law and order policies are not colorblind. She says because ideas about race adapt, she argues that we've gradually changed our definition of who is a criminal and what kinds of behaviors we consider to be criminal behaviors. She says this has changed dramatically since the 80s, especially with Reagan's war on drugs. Some of the statistics that she gives us in this book, she says in less than 30 years, the prison population grew in the United States from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, with drug convictions accounting for the majority of the increase. She says the U.S. imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did during the regime of apartheid. She argues that studies show people of all colors use and sell illegal drugs at the same rate, but it's people of color who typically go to jail for drug crimes. And she says that in one's lifetime, a black man, 1 in 3 black men will be imprisoned at one point or another. Now, Alexander traces the money that's being channeled through federal grants in the war on drugs and the war on terrorism, and she shows that this money has gone to a lot of state and local police forces that have tended to militarize the police forces. What this means is that local police forces get things like rocket launchers, grenade launchers, armored vehicles. If you saw the photos in Ferguson, Missouri, you saw the armored vehicle there. She talks about the rise of SWAT teams in state and local police forces and how SWAT teams used to be used for violent crimes, and increasingly they're used for serving warrants, or they're used for more routine police duty. And she says that this is sort of militarizing the police and also creating a kind of war between the police and blacks in communities. Alexander says she used to see the criminal justice system and crime in terms of poverty, but she says now that she sees it in terms of race. And she says the reason she sees the criminal justice system in terms of race is because in America, our idea of class is about social mobility. It's about being able to move from being very poor to middle class to being very rich. And she says that with this new Jim Crow system of mass incarceration, folks who've been in prison can no longer have social mobility, that these folks are marginalized from the mainstream community. And to understand this, she describes mass incarceration not just as the prison system itself, but she says it's also the larger web of rules, laws, policies, and customs that control and label those who are criminals both in and outside of prison. Now, what she means by this is once folks are released from prison, they've served their time, that former prisoners enter a world that she calls an underworld of legalized discrimination and permanent social exclusion. And I'll detail a few ways that ex-convicts are marginalized from society in just a minute. Now, she describes the system of mass incarceration in 3 steps. The first stage is what she calls the roundup. And she says police conduct drug operations in black communities focusing on crack cocaine, marijuana in specific neighborhoods, that there's a lot of discretion here that the police use when they decide what neighborhood to go into. She says here at the investigatory stage, police stop and frisk, and they often will use race as a way to select who they're going to stop and frisk. After the arrest, in the accusatory and the trial stages, Alexander also details what she calls this period of formal control, where she says race also acts as a kind of proxy for criminality. She says often there's a lack of good legal representation, which forces people to plead guilty even if they're not. There's also prosecutor discretion that might add more charges. And after the trial and conviction, once prisoners serve their time in prison and are released, under the drug war sentencing laws, the final phase of what she calls the invisible punishment then begins. This is invisible because it's outside of public view, that a lot of ex-convicts who can no longer vote, who can't get housing, who can't get a job, it's invisible. It's outside of our public view. She says criminal sanctions are then imposed against ex-convicts, and ex-convicts are allowed to be discriminated against in employment, in housing, in education, and in public benefits. Ex-convicts are not hired by businesses, and they're not eligible for public housing. They cannot get student loans, and they're often denied other public benefits. Many states deny ex-convicts the right to vote. She sees this whole system as a way of marginalizing a whole group of people who've come in touch with the criminal justice system. And she argues that we must view the system of mass incarceration as a whole. She uses the analogy of a bird cage, and she says, if we only look at specific wires in a bird cage, we can't really see how the bird is captured by the entire cage. We have to look at the whole. We have to look at all of those wires tied together, encapsulating in what she says, caging black men. Now, we've convened this panel today to talk about some of these issues raised by this important book, and I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
D.A. Early.
Okay,
Thank you.
it's good to be here. I have read most of the book now by Michelle Alexander. Be willing to give it, a lot of questions are raised reading the book. And I've been the district attorney in Worcester County now for 8 years, but prior to that I was a defense attorney for 17 years. I have some differences of opinion with some things that are in the book. I have some agreements with things that are in the book. It can acknowledge a lot of things with regards to it. When I was a defense attorney, I had a lot of people walk through my doors. And your job as a defense attorney is to give the best job that you can for your client. I look at the book, and historically, we go back to how Black America has been treated in the United States. And historically, I think it's gotten better through the ages. I think we're constantly making advances, but I don't know of anyone in Worcester County with regards to especially the work that we're doing that can say, you know, that racism is prevalent in the criminal justice system in Worcester County. We make decisions, we make recommendations on jail time based on the crime. Oftentimes we're called into neighborhoods where arrests are made based on complaints within the neighborhood, based on violence within the neighborhood. And there's no simple answers. You look at drugs right now, whether it be crack, whether it be cocaine, or whether it be opiate addiction. We've had 40, 45 overdoses, deaths, opiate overdose deaths since July 1st of this year. I don't know that there are any easy answers. I don't know that there are classifications. I do know that once you have been arrested and the stigma is attached, it makes it that much harder in society now. I've been told that a family of four where a husband and wife are working, just as little as 4 years ago, that median income was about $72,000. That $72,000 is worth about $42,000 these days. So, you know, class society in general, I don't think I'm qualified to answer as many things about the wealth that people have, the wealth that people don't have. But I do know that once you are arrested, it makes it that much harder for housing, for loans, for things of that nature. For those reasons, we've put a big emphasis in my office on prevention. We get into the schools and talk about a whole host of things. From domestic violence to drugs and alcohol, to texting and driving, you name it. Across the board, we talk about a lot of things. I'd much rather prevent a crime than have to solve a crime. And also what we've done lately is partner with corrections, partner with parole, partner with faith-based agencies, local agencies, to do more on reentry, to try and stop the cycle of people coming back to jail, to give people the opportunity to get a job, to give people the opportunity to get in drug and alcohol programs, to get people away from their old friends who helped guide them to this path in the first place, to take more responsibility once they're out. And we're working on 2 reentry programs, big programs right now, that I'm hoping are going to work. I don't think we can arrest our way out of the problem. I don't think we can prosecute our way out of the problem. But what I see in Worcester County is we try and do everything, treat people equally, no matter who they are. And we all, you know, our basic thing is quality of life here and quality of life issues.
Interesting stuff, without a doubt. Mr. Grant.
I see the front row is just as popular now as when I was in college. And I certainly would have been sitting way back there. So I guess I can speak to my experience because, as the vice president said, I've spent the majority of my adult life in prison. And that is a very true statement. But for me, it's been by choice. I started as a school teacher, and I left that profession to come and be a counselor and work with people who are incarcerated. You know, we have a strange demographic in the prison systems across the country where about 53% of our population makes up some type of minority. And that's a fact. And, you know, I think Mr. Early makes a very good point. We're not going to arrest our way out of it. We're not going to incarcerate our way out of it. And unfortunately, we're so far behind the skew that we're probably not going to re-enter our way out of it or jail aversion our way out of it in the very near future. You know, the average age of an inmate in Massachusetts is about 40 years old for a male. It's about 35 years old for a female. And although the book, The New Jim Crow, talks about the war on drugs, the good majority of our folks are incarcerated for crimes against a person. And I think if we looked at statistics, we'd find that out. Now, statistics are funny because you can prove any point you want by using statistics. I've learned that in this job. Whether we want to get money from the legislature, whether we're trying to get funding for a program, or whether we're trying to get funding to get a new prison, or get new correction officers, or get new training, or work on the war on opiate addiction, we can use statistics to make our case. what I would say is I think just as strong as race is education. The average education of someone incarcerated in Massachusetts is about between the 5th and the 6th grade. Think about if you stopped going to school in the 5th or 6th grade, how you would have survived, what you would have made of yourself, where you would have come from. So to me, although I find the book interesting and it makes valid points, I think that education and the lack thereof and the quality thereof is an important factor. Now, I'm from, we talk about 1 in every 3 black males in the book should be incarcerated. Well, I'm a father of 4, and obviously they're black males, and none of us have been incarcerated yet. So, but I attribute that to all my sons are minimally educated to the high school level. So I've always thought that. As far as the Department of Corrections, our focus right now is on reentry. So that means when offenders come back to the community and we're trying to reintegrate them and get them ready, first of all, we're trying to send them back less damaged than they came in. There is the thought that all inmates have incurred trauma within their life, whether that trauma be induced by another person, by their situation of their life, and now by their imprisonment. Because it's unnatural to have people being unfree and unable to move as they want, having someone tell them what to do. Does it sound similar to the military? Yes, it is. The original jails in the country were military jails, and they were bound by wars for the most part. So, there is that distinction. But what I would say to you is that look broader for the issue. Capitalism, in my opinion, is much stronger than racism, and corrections and criminal justice is a $1 billion industry, and I don't think anybody's willing to give up their $1 billion. So I'll leave you with that as we move forward.
Interesting stuff. Mr. Hussey.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here today and addressing the role of race in the criminal justice system, and especially the role that we as players or actors in that system have. As Vice President noted in his speech, race in the criminal justice system, the issues around that have been issues, for hundreds of years, are timely now given the events of Ferguson and otherwise, and will continue to be for years to come. And as Michelle Alexander argues in their book, the question of race and what role it plays in the criminal justice system is probably always should be a question at the forefront of people's minds. Just to give you I want to tell you a little bit about myself so I can answer some of the questions later. I'm the head of the Public Defender's Office for the county, which means that, just to explain what that means in Massachusetts, it's about 75% of the people in Massachusetts who are poor, largely minority, who cannot afford an attorney, are appointed an attorney by what's called the Committee for Public Services. Most of those are private lawyers. 75% of the cases are handled by private lawyers, and mostly misdemeanors. The other 25% are handled by our office, and I oversee a staff of about 30 lawyers, 10 of whom handle all the pretty much serious cases in the county of Worcester. And throughout the state, there's an office like mine in every county. And so my office would handle cases like armed robberies and attempted murders and rapes and trafficking in heroin and cocaine. And that's what we do. So just to tell you, most cases are handled by private attorneys, but the public defenders, as people know them, staff attorneys, are the people that I work with and the people that I oversee. If I can just give you one perspective of that comes around in Michelle Alexander's book repeatedly, is that I live in the city of Worcester, and I've lived there approximately 30 years, and I live about 1.5 miles from the downtown area. And in that 30 years, I have probably met and talked to and interacted with more young black men in my office, in the courthouse, or in a prison than I have in a movie theater or in a restaurant or a bar or a sporting event. Now, that might be because of the dint of my position, but it's also a very sad commentary. And it also goes to the question of where, what Michelle Alexander asked repeatedly throughout her book, where have all the young black men gone? Now, Mr. Grant has just indicated that obviously not all young black men are in prison or in the throes of the criminal justice system. and kudos to his son and his family, but too many are. And it's a sad commentary that that's true, and I just kind of address some of that issues. That's the thrust of her book. One of the things I think it points to is the invisibility of this problem. Most white Americans, most people who are not, do not know somebody who's been in jail, are just like people who don't know people who have died in Afghanistan or in Iraq. It's somebody else's problem in somebody else's neighborhood and somebody else's cousin. And it is, because it's invisible, it can be ignored, or people can just not have it be part of their consciousness. And that's as big a problem as overt racism. Because I would agree with Mr. Early that overt racism is very rare in the criminal justice system, and the actors in it, the judges, prosecutors, police officers, defense attorneys, are no more racist or less racist than anybody else in our society. All of us carry implicit biases, but most people don't know what's going on. It's somebody else's problem. And forums like these, I think, are a great way to begin this discussion and this shining light on this issue, this problem, and in this nation. I think it's fair to say, the people ask me, a lot of times, they use the word, the criminal justice system is racist. Okay, there's two reasons I would say I don't think that's a right way I don't think that's a good question, and I don't know that I could give that answer. If by racist we mean that there are people who believe that one race is better than the other and use a system to deliberately subjugate people or to keep them down, I would say that that's not true about the criminal justice system. It's like saying the death penalty. Is the death penalty racist? Well, not necessarily. If lots of people want to see white people want to kill other white people who have killed white people. The real issue, though, is the criminal justice system racially discriminatory, or does it have a disparate racial impact? If you're more likely to get the death penalty because you're black, or you're more likely to go to jail because you're black, well, then there's clearly a racially disparate treatment of blacks and other people of color. And I think that's true, as borne out in the book, and it's also consistent with the situation here in Massachusetts and in Worcester County. In the city of Boston, Latinos and African Americans and other blacks make up about 20% of the population, but close to 50% of the people who are locked up in prison or in the criminal justice system. 1/3 of black male dropouts in the city of Boston are in jail or in the criminal justice system. And so they are there's no question that people of color and the community of color are overrepresented in the criminal justice system based on what their population would be in the city and in the state of Massachusetts. In Worcester County, as most of you would know, there are not that many people statistically who are African American. A lot of what my experience is, I think, is borne out when you have inner city communities, which in Fitchburg, Worcester, Southbridge, and the like in Worcester County are communities of color because of so many people are Latinos. I think so I would suggest that it's really have to focus on, what is the impact of the policies and the laws and the statutes we have, and the way that resources are allocated. How do the police act? Which cases are prosecuted? Which cases come to their attention? What do juries do? What do judges do? And there's where you find, I think, the racially disparate impact, all of which has to do with structural problems in our society, which are wrapped up in the question of race. I happen to agree with one of her major tenets that the war on drugs has been a disaster and continues to be a disaster for our whole society, and especially detrimental to communities of color in this country. And I don't say any of what I'm saying today, and I don't come from a perspective of being like some bleeding heart liberal who doesn't think people should go to jail. Okay, I've represented too many people who have done violence and done violent acts and have hurt people in their own family, have hurt strangers, have killed them, have raped them. So I certainly can appreciate that there are a number of people in this state who, in the criminal justice system deserve to be locked up, to protect the rest of us, to punish them, or whatever the case may be. As Mr. Grant indicated, most people are there in prisons in Massachusetts for crimes against the person, but I think that's also related to what I have found in my experience to be an outgrowth of the war on drugs. Too many of my clients are addicted to drugs. Almost everybody I meet, is somehow has a substance abuse problem or is addicted to drugs, or has mental illness. Again, the jails are becoming, and I'm sure Mr. Grant can speak to this at length, the depositories of mentally ill people. And if you don't get proper resources, again, that's a problem in the inner city communities, proper resources for mental health, you will end up in jail. So prisons, there are too many nonviolent offenders, or there are violent offenders because they need to rob a convenience store to get drugs. They need to sell drugs to get used drugs. They need to break into your houses and break into your homes so that they can get high, or that they can be part of gangs which are really deriving their whole livelihood and support from the sale of drugs. And so that you have a whole kinds of violence that grows out of that. The prohibitionist policies of the drug war. It also leads, there's also the other problem is you have this intense, hyper-vigilant, aggressive police fighting the war on drugs in inner city communities, and which leads people in those communities to feel that the police are racist and that the whole system is racist because of the allocation of resources in those particular communities. There is, in my opinion, in this state, in this county, in this country, too much of a focus on punishment, retribution, and which are all valuable things. It's all important that we have punishment. It's important that we incapacitate people. Some people have to be taken out of society. We need to, some of our laws be based on deterrence, deterring others from doing it. But too little, the district attorney mentioned, he's got some new ideas, and he's a progressive DA in the state, and not many are like him, which are addressing diversion from the system, crime prevention and the like. But there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of crime prevention, deterrence, rehabilitation, and the social and economic reintegration of inmates back into the community. I know that Mr. Grant was mentioning a little bit of that. In the book, Professor Alexander talks about collateral consequences, and the professor also noted this: what happens when people come out of jail? A lot of my clients say to me sometimes, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, I don't care. Why should I take that plea? When I get out, my life's still going to suck. I'm not going to be able to get a job. I'm not going to be able to go to college. I'm not going to be able to live in certain places. And that is really true, and it poses a tremendous problem. I just want to bring home, because for those of you who have read the book, Professor Alexander is talking nationally, and so she paints with a broad brush. I would like to give some indication of what things look like in Massachusetts. In terms of voting, you are not prohibited for life if you're convicted of a felony. You merely can't vote while you're in prison. That's better than a lot of states. You are not allowed to serve on a jury, though, for 7 years, which some people may argue is appropriate or not appropriate. In her book, she talks about the ability, that lawyers have the ability, DAs have the ability to bounce people off juries, to not let people be jurors, for silly and dumb reasons, and that what they're really doing is keeping African Americans and Latins off juries. That's not the case in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, you can't use a silly reason, as she calls it, quote unquote. A judge will make a determination whether you sincerely want that person off the jury and that you have an adequate reason for doing so. So it's not like people who African Americans, Latins show up for jury, they're going to get thrown off for the color of their skin. That's not likely to happen. Housing is still a serious problem in terms of our housing authorities in Section 8. It's very difficult for felons to live in those kind of places or live with their mother who doesn't even have a record. There's all kinds of restrictions on your ability to do that. As she writes in the book, that's a tremendous problem because you're creating a problem of homelessness for ex-prisoners. New York's had a model program going for a couple years of trying to see if they can reintegrate felons into housing authorities, and hopefully that's something that will happen here. There's been some important developments in Massachusetts in terms of employment, what's known as CORI reform, Criminal Offender Record Index reform. It's now illegal for employers hiring over 6 people to ask on a written application whether you've ever been convicted. You can do that later in a personal interview, but you cannot deny someone for a job or give them an application that says, have you been convicted of a felony? There's been some progressive work done in the world in the area of sealing your record. After 5 years or 10 years, you can move to seal your record, arguing that you have a good reason to do so, which almost everybody always does. It's going to keep me from getting a job. It's going to keep me from getting housing. So Deval-Patrick and other legislatures have done some good work in that area. We still have a problem with driver's licenses because you lose your license from 2 to 5 years if you're convicted of distribution of various kinds of drugs, marijuana, cocaine, heroin. That obviously poses a tremendous problem for people when they get out of prison. And you lose your license even if you have the driving of the car has nothing to do with the offense that you're charged with. Not out of a sense of defensiveness, but I will tell you that she does criticize representation by public defenders, who most people of color and most poor people have as attorneys. That's fair across the country. That's not fair in Massachusetts, a fair critique, because we have adequate resources. We do not have high caseloads. We have supervision. And addressing the issues we're talking about today, we have a lot of training, not only for young lawyers who are becoming public defenders, but ongoing training to address how they're going to be as criminal defense attorneys addressing racial issues in the court, in their court cases, but also to try to explore what implicit biases they bring to the job, what implicit biases they bring to their own clients. People always ask me, can a black guy get a fair trial in Worcester, and I always say, I don't know. Depends on the case, depends on the facts of the case a lot of times. Depends on the race of the victim. Might be easier to be found not guilty if you're charged with assaulting another member of the community because of prejudice about that, as opposed to a black man charged with assaulting a white woman or man. But one thing I would always have to say to my clients is, can I tell you that we're going to get all the racists off the jury? Can I tell you that people aren't implicitly stereotypically biased? Can I tell you that they're going to look maybe harder at a black guy charged with when he claims self-defense than he wasn't the aggressor? Is the presumption of innocence going to be higher? Are they going to look at an expert who's African American differently than an expert in white? I can't tell you that that's not going to be the case. In the end, I think everybody's noted this, and Mr. Grant used the word capitalism, and I won't use the word democratic socialism or anything, but outright, but I think that the criminal problems of race in the criminal justice system are the same problems that exist in terms of every other system we have: education, housing, employment, and everything else. And without structural reform of inequality in all facets of our society, we're not really going to be able to tackle really adequately the problem of race and inequality in our criminal justice system.
Excellent. Very thought-provoking comments. I'm going to throw out a couple of questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up for the audience to do the same. In your presentations, all of you talked about drug crimes being one of the main focuses of the book, and how the vast majority of new offenders are in drug-related crimes. States across the country are moving towards decriminalization, first of marijuana. We'll see where that leads. Do you think that's a step in the right direction in dealing with the imbalances that you all spoke about? Eric? Or Joe? Yeah.
No. On that, most of the people in the addiction centers are telling us now, whether it's a gateway drug or not a gateway drug, it's open to a lot of interpretation. But we're finding out now, for example, with the opiate abuse, it starts with a pill. For a lot of people, it starts with a pill from a doctor. And after taking a couple of those pills, your body chemistry changes. If you're prone to addiction, you're going to have more problems. We've been seeing 23, 24, 25-year-old kids die of heroin. When I was at college, when I was at UMass, people didn't put needles in their arms. Now you can get a pack of heroin for less than a bag of heroin for less than a pack of cigarettes. It is so cheap. Coming up from Mexico, I was one of the people that fought against the decriminalization for a bunch of reasons. Number one, what we know as we've just removed mandatory sentencing for juveniles, that the child's brain is constantly developing. The marijuana that's out there now, when I was in college, it's 70 times stronger than what it was then. You talk to the people in Denver, and they say it's just been a nightmare. Marijuana is pervaded just about every part of society. You can get it in gummy bears. Now you can get it in brownies. You can get it in all these different foods. But they've had a lot of hospitalizations with regards to the overuse of marijuana. What they're also telling us is a message that you send into kids is that basically it's okay to smoke pot. We see a lot of carnage on the roads. You know, someone might tell you, well, I've never seen a guy kill 3 people violently that was high. No, but we do see people behind the wheels of automobiles that causes problems. So I think it sends the wrong message. In Worcester, when I got elected, we didn't charge. Once I got the diversion program in place, prior to your arraignment, we postponed the arraignment and put you in a diversion program. And as Mr. Hussey can tell you, at another point back, a young college kid might come in who got arrested for possession of marijuana. And mom or dad might come with him, and aunt might come with him. Case would be continued without a finding for a period of about 6 months. Mom or dad would pay a $200, $300, $400, $500 fine, and that'd be the end of it. But then some of the things Professor Alexander talks about in the book would kick in. You get a record for the rest of your life. What we did with marijuana, and we do it with alcohol, is prior to arraignment, we postpone the arraignment. People give us 8 hours of community service. Put them out in the community. We pick up parks. We help clean up ball fields. We plant seed and grass on areas where kids are playing sports. They give us 8 hours. They do a 1-hour online test. I dismissed the case prior to arraignment. You know, and that never got out there because there's a guy named Soros out in California, spent about $750,000, you know, to help. Eventually the goal is to legalize drugs, decriminalize pot. But I just don't think decriminalization sends the right message.
Interesting.
Just my opinion.
Thoughts? Mike?
Well, I think we should have legalization of marijuana. I think the biggest gateway drug is alcohol. I think that we send if we send in any, I would support, I suppose, I would concede that we should have marijuana illegal if we made beer illegal, because we certainly send a lot of bad messages about the use of alcohol through magazine ads, TV ads, portrayals in the media and whatsoever. To the argument that, you know, it's causing problems in Denver and places like that, it's certainly true because it's not properly regulated, that nobody knows how high they're basically getting. And like any drug, when they dropped prohibition against alcohol, I mean, there was all kinds of regulations that were already in place that people understood what they were doing, and they were educated about how to use it. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Colorado now. The problem of youth, the use of drugs or alcohol, whatever the case may be, with youth, young people, is one issue, but I have to disagree with the DA about the legalization with regard to adult use that's properly regulated and people are educated as to what they're doing. As to the question of more, serious drugs, there have been interesting experiments done in Portugal and other countries which have more relaxed, have more treatment, allow people to use drugs like, recreationally. And I think it's really the problem of making everything illegal is people have to do illegal things to get high. If they could just get high, maybe they wouldn't do so many illegal things that involve the rest of us in danger and violence.
Interesting. Eric?
This is certainly a national question that we're facing here with decriminalizing marijuana in particular, and I want to make a distinction between the heroin and the marijuana. You see this in some place like sports, where you have a football player who was suspended for the entire season for using marijuana. Now the NFL is sort of rethinking that, thinking, well, is that too harsh? Is that too harsh a penalty? And we talked about a teenager getting caught with marijuana, having to go in to a trial and possibly facing a conviction. Now, this person may have just been trying it, or the things that Michelle Alexander talks about in terms of being marginalized after your conviction after that. Are we willing to throw away someone's life for a marijuana conviction?
Interesting. Mike?
So, I probably get to sit across from more convicted felons than anybody in the room. I don't know if that's a badge of honor or that's just the circumstance of my employment. But for about 25 or 30 years, I've had long conversations with more people who are incarcerated than those who aren't. And believe it or not, many current and former inmates are really against the decriminalization of marijuana. And they'll tell you it's because of what Mike said here. They couldn't control it as kids, and that there needs to be better control of how it works. What I can tell you is that I don't see people doing large sentences for possession of marijuana, Class D. I am a novice attorney, and only to the point where I try to refer people to get the best information they can when they're trying to resolve their cases. But most cases that involve drugs involve weights and amounts, and they always did, at least prior to some of the reform in the laws. So, you know, unless people got caught with substantial amounts of marijuana, you weren't ever seeing people going to jail for smoking joints. You know, whether it should be legal or not, I 100% agree that, you know, I sat on the governor's panel for when we started to talk about the dispensaries for marijuana. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in how it's regulated. And I think that's the scary thought, as me being a dad, being a grandfather of 4, I don't see the regulation in that. I don't discriminate at all between the difference between being addicted to alcohol or being addicted to drugs. I spent the majority of my career dealing with people who have been committed no crimes for the most part, and they're in jail because they're addicted to alcohol or drugs, or because they have a mental illness. And I've dealt with that constantly through the years. And I will tell you that I do feel like alcohol is as much of a gateway drug into other things than just as much as marijuana. So I guess that's the best I can say without really picking a side. You know, I just.
All right, let me go to the flip side of the marijuana. Oh, good.
There's
Please.
one other thing I wanted to mention there. Folks who are in favor of decriminalization of marijuana have been criticized lately for reinscribing a racial hierarchy. In other words, in Colorado and Washington, where it's been decriminalized, a lot of folks are saying it's only white folks who can afford to pay the prices for this, that include the tax, that include the regulations. And what it does is it pushes folks who can't afford that into the black market, where they're then going to be arrested.
Interesting. Let me go to the flip side of the marijuana question. One of the other things she talks about there is that part of the reason why drugs make up such a disparate proportion of new arrests is because it's also become a funding mechanism through seizures and forfeitures for a lot of police departments throughout the country. Do you think this is part of the concern that she raises in the book?
I don't. I disagree on that. The money, a lot of the money that we get on the seizures, we put back into the community. Boys and Girls Club up in Fitchburg, Boys and Girls Club in Milford, Youth Center in Milford, Project Luck up here, domestic violence program, sports teams, Fitchburg High School football uniforms, Fitchburg girls volleyball uniforms. I don't. The money doesn't motivate us. I'd rather get funded by the legislature to where I think we should be. We get a lot of underpaid DADAs, as they get a lot of underpaid defense attorneys as well that work full-time with CPCS. I don't see the forfeiture as a motivation, but I will differentiate on a couple of things. With the federal system. The federal system, it's much different than the state system. The federal system, the penalties, you can see they're almost draconian in certain instances. You can see 20, 30-year penalties that you might get a 2 or 3 year sentence on the state level. And, you know, for me, the question is, whether it be when I was a defense attorney or as a DA, you know, at what point do you give up on the person? Don't you want to get the person treated? Don't you want to get the person off the addiction and get them back to be a producing member of society? You know, which I think is first and foremost the issue. But as far as the forfeiture money goes, no, that's not a motivation for us. No.
Interesting. Mr. Hussey?
I would say that's true. I don't think that police, generally speaking, in Massachusetts or otherwise, are motivated to make drug busts, to get the car, to get the cash, and the like. I mean, there's always stories of this town and that town throughout the country in which, you know, some officers of that department, you know, went out to try to do that kind of stuff. But I don't see that as a largely something that drives the war on drugs or drives police behavior.
Interesting.
Another point that she makes, though, is it's that the incentive to get military equipment is certainly there, and the police are getting that military equipment, and then what are they going to use it for?
Well, I think some of the readings that I've done in that area indicate that the push to get that military hardware came from the federal government disposing of it, and the incentive of defense contractors to, you know, have a market for it in the future. And you know, they always say, about a play. If there's a gun on the wall in the first act of the play, it'll be used by the third. And that's what happens with police departments or in any institution. If you give people things, they'll usually find a way to use them and rationalize using them. And I think that's perfectly borne out in Ferguson. And any sensible police department that was more involved with their community, instead of three black officers out of 53 total black officers in that town, or you wouldn't have seen that kind of reaction by a sensible police department. I don't think you'd see that in the city of Worcester, that they would have acted that way. I mean, that was just a terrible example of sort of how things drive people.
Yeah, indeed.
I would agree on that too. We don't need any tanks. When I see those pictures, it makes me shudder. You want police officers that are invested in the community. You don't want them behind a wall of steel. You want police interacting. You want to see it be racially appropriate on the police makeups. You like to see the towns. You go back to the broken windows approach down in New Jersey, where the police officers are on the footbeat, talking to the elderly. The crime numbers don't go down, but people feel comfortable because they see the police there. You see racial makeups that are consistent with the neighborhoods, racial makeups that are consistent with the racial makeup of the city or the town in general, being able to speak the language. But I don't like tanks, and I don't see the need. I'm glad Worcester hasn't moved for any military hardware. I'm glad Fitchburg hasn't moved for any military hardware.
There you go.
So what does the Department of Corrections have to do with anything that happens out in the community? Well, the Department of Corrections is a large broker of intelligence that goes out to all the law enforcement communities, not only in New England, but federally. We were involved in the active pursuit and capture of Whitey Bulger. We work a lot on drug seizures and enforcement, and a lot on criminal activity. Why is that? Because we have criminals that have a lot of information that they like to broker out, and we monitor that. But what I will tell you is that the asset forfeiture process is very complicated. And I don't think anybody goes out to do their job with that in mind. And most times with us, because we are involved in many arrests out in the community, that's just kind of a sidebar to what happens. But I would agree that one thing is that the federal government is willing to give away just about anything if you wait long enough, and whether it comes from the military or whether it comes from other things. There's a surplus list. You have to have a certain clearance to be on it. Mass Department of Corrections is part of the Metlet SWAT program and the Boston PD, and we have all types of stuff that we're probably never going to use, and they've become coat racks and trash barrels. But people give you things, and as a society, we love to take people's things.
Yes.
So,
undoubtedly true. So perhaps the most common criticism of the book, or I don't know if criticism is the right word, but most common critique of the book that you see is that there's no doubt there is, and I like the phrase we used, a disparate impact that we see from the system. The question is the variable. Is it race, as the author identifies, or is it class? Is it being rich is better than being poor, no matter what color you are? And is that what drive the system? That poor people are more likely to end up in the system than rich people?
So I'll stop first this time,
Please.
because these guys go and they take all the good stuff. So I would say that you don't meet a lot of millionaires in jail, at least in state correctional facilities. They tend not to be there, although there are some people who are of means and are educated. That's not the majority of our folks. I would say that it's a hodgepodge of a lot of things. I think I said education would be one of those things. I do believe race is one of those things, but I believe that people tend to live in pockets, and people tend to live in pockets in areas that they stay with their own kind for the most part. Some of those things might be classified as ghettos. Some of them might end up being public housing. Some of them might be neighborhoods. And within those certain neighborhoods, there's an element of acceptable behavior, and some of that might be unlawful. So I think there's validity to saying that race is one of those factors that would get you put in jail, but I think it has to do with all the other environmental factors that are around those folks that end up getting arrested. You know, the difference for me is that, you know, we really have no choice in who comes. The door is always open to get in.
Yeah.
It's just not open to get out.
Yes.
But again, I do also think that, you know, if you have the means to have better representation, you do better in court. And I've seen people with the exact same charges do varying amounts of time in the system. And that's just the facts. I mean, I'm certainly not, you know, at liberty to come up here and tell you stories. I mean, so I would say that, you know, if you know folks, and I'm one of those people that know a lot of people that have been incarcerated, not because I work with them also, because they're from the neighborhood I'm from. I grew up in New Bedford. Well, I grew up in Roxbury, and I moved into the suburb of New Bedford, which is kind of a joke. And then, you know, and now I live where I live in Carver, Massachusetts. But from those neighborhoods where I grew up, I know tons and tons of people who have been incarcerated. I see them at work. I see them when they get out. Their families call my house. You know, they see my mother in church. They ask, how's Mike, and can he help my son or my daughter? And so to me, it's the norm that people from where I grew up are incarcerated. So, you know, that is, you know, that's a sign of how it is. So,
Thoughts, race or class?
so I think again, it's a combination of both. You know, I think if you're an affluent black person, you stand a very high chance to not be incarcerated. And if you're a poor white person, you probably stand a better chance to be incarcerated. I think economics has a lot to do with it.
Good. Interesting. Eric?
One of the things that I think about is the public image that we have of who are criminals. And if we think that in our mind, and let me do a little thought experiment with you here for a minute. Think in your mind a face of someone who is an illegal immigrant. Is that face white? Now, one of the things that we know is that the third largest population of illegal immigrants is from Canada. Do you see a Canadian face when you think of an illegal immigrant? The same holds true, I think, for the kind of cultural associations that we might have with race and crime, with a black face and with crime. I'm willing to say that it's both race and class, but I think in the U.S., class is racialized in a very distinct, very unique way.
Interesting.
I would just say that you can't separate the two, okay? But if we somehow miraculously equalized, if we really made a society full of social and political equalities, such that there were jobs in the inner city, and there were better schools in the inner city, and there were better health care in the inner city, which serving communities of color, I still feel like there would still be a disparate impact on racial minorities based on implicit biases and other focuses on certain neighborhoods of color by police, the allocation of those resources. So I'm a big class guy. I think that you can't get away from the problem of race. But I guess reversing what I just said, if you could do something about class, you'd go a long way. If you could make this a lot better equality in our society, we'd have less of a race problem a disparate race problem in the criminal justice system.
Interesting. Mr. Dean?
I think it's a combination of both. And just my personal opinion, I mentioned some figures at the beginning when I spoke, how $70,000, that $70,000 a family made 4 years ago is only worth the equivalent of about $40,000 now. That's scary. My other question, I talk to Tim Connolly, our communications director, all the time. How much money is enough? How many millions do people need? And do you see the philanthropy? Do you see the giving back? I don't see it as much as we used to see it. I love spending drug forfeiture money on kids. Before my father died, he said, don't you ever let anyone stop you from spending that money to help kids, keeping them busy. I don't see it, and it scares me. I think white, black, yellow, brown. I think everyone needs an education. I think we need to do more with our schools. I think with an education you can do anything. But I think as you see the richest separating from the poorest, it alarms me. It scares me for a lot of different reasons. For a lot of different reasons. And can that person we know if we get a person through high school, they're 50%, without an alcohol or drug problem, they're 50% less likely to be involved with the criminal justice system. If they drop out by their junior year, they're 60% more likely to be involved. Sophomore year, 70%. Freshman year, 80%. You know, and at that point, how do you ever dig your way back up? Good question.
Well, I mean, it really gets to the heart of the theory of the book, right? That there's this inherent racism that is finds a route through the criminal justice system in order to go and wreak the havoc that it does. But if class is the factor, I don't think there's an inherent bias against people who are poor, because there are a lot more of them than there are people who are rich. So there has to be, I get that they're intertwined, but if the theory of the book is correct, that this is an outlet for the prior racist acts that existed under the Jim Crow system, class would have to undermine that theory if that's really the determining factor.
Well, there are more poor white people than poor black people, and more black people in jail.
Yep.
So the question is, how do you answer that?
And then maybe
if
it goes
race
back
isn't
to
the
race.
problem?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Very
I
good
think
point.
Mike was getting at a lot of it having to do with neighborhoods and certain behaviors, but it also has to do with where the prosecution's happening. How are drugs distributed in Gardner and Winchendon? How are they distributed on the streets of downtown in Worcester and in the Cleghorn and Fitchburg? Sometimes in those places, it's like shooting fish in a barrel for the cops.
Yeah.
And
Excellent
in
point.
other communities, it's harder.
Well, I certainly think that's part of our argument, is that the sweeps that happen in communities of color, she says, are targeted to sweep up offenders. And if the police were going into white communities, they may just, in fact, find as many drug users, but they're not going into those communities.
Right. Now, there's some people who say, well, we wouldn't have such a race problem in our criminal justice system if we've just arrested a lot more white people. The problem is we would arrest a lot more poor white people,
Right.
and the people who make political decisions in our society are not poor white people. So poor white people, poor black people, poor brown people are getting screwed basically by indifference and apathy by everybody else.
Interesting. All right, let me open it up to the audience. Questions, please. And we have a microphone that will come around if you need, but go.
So I came here, I'm a Fitchburg born and raised political science major here at Fitchburg State. One of my biggest things that I've learned over the years is education for our youth. So my question coming in here, and then first the DA talking, and then the gentleman next to you talking, is when you're discussing education for our youth, how young do we need to go? There was a murder outside of my house last year, and I had to speak with my 8-year-old about the problems of the drugs in the neighborhood and of the murder. So here you're talking about 5th and 6th grade education. So if you're walking into middle schools, already there's a stigma because of children who have older siblings. And then if you're going into high schools, you've already missed this generation of people. So at what age is it appropriate to go in and start speaking to these children?
The question here is, at what age is it appropriate to start speaking to children?
Okay. Let me just structure my answer. It starts at conception. It does. And I heard that. The first time I heard it, I thought the person was crazy. Here's why it starts at conception. You get a mother, prenatal nutrition, okay? You get a mother set up, especially the single parent, set up with agency help, okay? So then when the child's born, you get a healthy baby. Then the agencies are in place to help. You get that child into pre-K, and pre-K is huge. We know that 40% of the children who don't get into pre-K can never make up the gap between those who are in pre-K, whether it be rich or poor, and those who actually go, okay? If you get them into pre-K, they get into school, they hit the ground running, they get a better chance of learning in school, staying up to date in school, staying current in school, being less truant, and actually getting through high school without a drug or an alcohol problem. We know, and that's what the statistics tell us. That's what I believe. You start at conception. I don't know, because Michael can tell you, when I was a defense attorney, I knew you could modify and change behaviors with young people, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. But at a certain point, it's harder and harder to modify those behaviors. It's harder to change kids. But when you get to them when they're young, you can make those changes. You know, after a certain period of time, I'll put it this way. Take 100% of the kids who get into trouble, okay? 80% are going to have 1 or 2 brushes with the law. They're going to be okay. They're going to have a strong parent, teacher, guidance, someone in their life they're going to identify with. Someone's going to help them on the straight and narrow. 5%, no matter what you do, they're going to be involved in the criminal justice system. It's just going to work that way. Now, the 15% in between can go either way. They can go either way. And I think as a society, that's where our responsibility lies, is to doing everything we can to make sure that 15% goes with the 80%.
Excellent.
I'll only talk about education to this degree. It's teaching our society, it's teaching, in this case, minority societies or low-income societies to value education. Too much it's on how am I going to get out of this situation and how am I going to make ends meet. But nowhere along the way is education made to be a valuable commodity. Well, that's not the emphasis. I talk to young men and young women all the time, and they say, my parents never told me to go to school. I mean, one of the greatest experiences I have is, and I'm most proud of a few things in my life, but one of them is my mother taught me to read when I was 4. And that opened up the world for me to learn a lot of things on my own. You know, and my father, who grew up in the 50s, when black men in Boston were waiters, and they were shining cars, and they worked in warehouses, and they were porters, said to me, education is going to set you free, it's going to help you. And my mother strengthened that, and that's what I learned. Now, I can't tell you, I mean, we just started a program in the male prisons and in the female prisons, and it's called Read to Me Daddy and Read to Me Mommy, where the inmates are reading to their kids. Now, a lot of these guys cannot read. They cannot read. So how are you going to succeed if education hasn't been one of the valuable things? I mean, as far as the minority community, and we get so excited about athletes and all the things they do, but yet education is what they need, and it needs to be emphasized that it's important. So I don't want to make out, I don't want to lose that concept. I really believe that education is the key to systematically break down a lot of these things that have been going on that include racism and casteism.
Excellent. Other thoughts? Okay, questions? Please.
Could you use the
Mike's
microphone
coming
just
up.
so we can get it on film? Thank you.
You say that we need more police officers in white neighborhoods, but I actually have police officers in my neighborhood because there's more break-ins. So I think that maybe that the police officers, and I'm from Worcester, from a suburban part, and I think that like maybe those police officers should focus on other parts. Like, do you see what I'm trying to say?
Is the question, should we have more police officers, or should we work on other programs that may not need as many police officers? Is that
Yeah.
okay? I think some of our panelists said that more policing isn't necessarily the answer. What do we do about police officers in the community, though? How?
I don't know if this answers the question, but one of the things is how do police officers deal with situations that arise? You know what I mean? Whether it's a joint 5 years ago, or whether it's drinking now, or whether there's disturbing the peace or a fight. There's a lot of power that police have to be discretionary, and the more they understand the community, the more they understand the people that they're working with, you're going to have that discretion exercised appropriately. And I think that's one of the things that the book is about, and has been marked, in a lot of communities. The same things that rowdy white kids were doing, they were getting a free pass, and rowdy kids of color weren't getting a free pass on. And you don't see that as much. Like in the city of Worcester, you don't see either kind of kid brought in on a lot of crappy stuff. I would give credit to the police department in some of the bigger cities in this county. But that's always been a problem, and that's something that people need to be concerned, acknowledging.
From my perspective, a good example is down at University Park over by Clark. The Worcester Gang Unit ran a basketball league. All the gang police officers, multiracial, donated their own time. I gave them some money, and we had just about all gang kids. But they get to see a police officer. They get to identify with a police officer. Police officers, as Ms. Hussey just said, have a lot of discretion, and it was nothing but beneficial. Number one, it kept them busy. Number two, it showed them, for some of them, police wasn't a bad role model, that you could make a decent living doing it. But it also allowed a lot of the people from the neighborhoods to go back into the neighborhoods and identify with the kids and at-risk kids.
Joe? Question, please. I'm going to pass the mic down.
Okay. My question is, how do you begin to emphasize the importance of education when there's such a gap between urban schools and suburban schools and things like that? Because obviously dropping out of school is then a gateway to, you know, substance abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse, and the end goal is kind of just going to jail.
I think one of the first things we can do is valorize and put more money in and cheerlead for public schools. It's very, very difficult in public schools because of funding, because of resources issues. You've got the temptation of private schools, charter schools, and I think the public school system needs our support, needs our resources, needs our taxes.
It's a great question. That's the million-dollar question. How do you get more people interested in school? How do you get kids disciplined enough to study and to get through school? I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't think there's an easy answer to it, but that's a great question. Because as everyone pretty much, I think, is in agreement here, that could help solve quite a few of the problems that we do have.
Again, I think as society, you have to make it a valuable commodity. I think that in the book they talked about the church was one of the biggest outlets and inlets into different communities. You know, I can't remember the last time I went to church where at the end of the mass that the pastor or the priest said, make sure you do your homework. But it sounds funny, but it's the truth. I mean, it really is. I mean, you know, and I'm not talking about education. I'm not talking about everybody needs to get a PhD. Or everybody even needs to get a college degree. I'm just talking about everybody getting some type of education. The smartest person I knew was my grandmother. Didn't even go to grade school. She came from another country, but she read and read and read and read, and she imparted wisdom. And again, in my family, I mean, it's not an option to not go to graduate from high school. And I think that's how it used to be. That's old school, before there was iPhones and iPads and hyperspace and cyberspace and all these different things. We had to look in encyclopedias and you had to read. But I mean, I think we have to make being smart, and I'm not talking about being an A student, being in school, going to that institution, important. I mean, it's great that we talk about boys clubs and I'm a boy. I'm not Denzel, but I'm a Boys and Girls Club graduate. You know, I'm a YMCA graduate. That's where I learned how to swim. But you know, the two places I always remembered liking to go to was school every day. One of the reasons I got a hot lunch and I got to ride on a bus. And you know what? That was important. And going to church, because that's where all my friends had to go too. And I think if we could try to tie those two things together, we might have a better chance. But I mean, it's each one teach one. It's everybody reach back. Everybody make it important. I mean, you know, maybe the Nike shirt should say just go to school. I don't know, but I wish I had that answer, and I wouldn't sell it. I'd give it away if I knew, but I really, really am passionate. And I tell every single man and woman that I deal with in the system, if you don't get a high school education, by the time you leave here, you have failed. You have let the time do you.
Very good.
I'll just give a quick policy wonk answer. Sort of, schools are funded by local taxation. Poor communities don't have enough taxes to fund their schools. Suburbs do. We need to have a more equal system, that the people in the suburbs care more about the places where their parents grew up, which is oftentimes a city. It's making connection between people in the suburbs and people in the cities, and it's a movement to care for each other. It's as corny sounding as that, but it's sort of what Joe and Mike are also talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're building a political movement that tries to address that issue.
Indeed. Questions, please, in the back.
I can relate to what she's talking about in the book. Growing up during the era of Reagan, presidency, when the war on drugs all came into play. For like 9 years, I dealt personally with the law enforcement field, singling me out in a small town, arresting me more than 11 times, costing me probably $80,000 worth of money to stay out, to keep myself from not having a felony record. to the point where a man broke into my house because he was infatuated with my girlfriend at 2:30 in the morning. The fight ensued. They took me. They didn't take him. It wasn't even his house. And in this town, I came home from work one day, and my ex-girlfriend was at my house, and my girlfriend were having an argument, and they took me. I spent 4 days in the Fitchburg jail, so I know exactly where she's coming off on this book about how things aren't the way they are. You know, so I don't know how it's going exactly nowadays, because I don't really, when an officer approaches me, I just tell him, you got the wrong guy, and I walk away, because I don't even want to hear it, you know? So nowadays, I don't know how the younger generations handle it or how the law enforcement are doing their actions, but there is, to me personally, a definite point of view of that book.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing.
One of the things that strikes me about that is that how Professor Alexander talks about politicians using coded racial appeals to try and get votes. And she says one of those coded racial appeals is this appeal to law and order, that politicians who talk about being strong on law and order are engaging in what another scholar has called dog whistle politics, which means the dog whistle sounds and we kind of unconsciously respond to it. And I think that's what I was getting at before when I talked about what's the face that we see when we see an illegal immigrant, what's the face we see when we see a criminal, that there are these code words that have a kind of racial resonance to them. And I think criminal is one of those code words.
Yeah, it'd be a very different circumstance. Yep. Got another question right up. Got another question right up here.
Sorry, I'm a little sick, so my voice is a bit hoarse. But moving back to the war on drugs, coming from Brockton, Massachusetts, where it's a city largely impacted by the war on drugs, looking towards the historical context of it, of when it actually began in the 1970s, we're coming fresh off of the civil rights movement. Many of the civil rights leaders are now either deceased or irrelevant at this point, and now we have all these incarcerations of people on these drug offenses. More so is, while now we may not have such a racial overlook on it, back then when it actually began, and there was such racism still prevalent in American hearts, is the war on drugs actually perpetuating the cycle now? It's been established for over 40 years now, and we look at things such as marijuana incarceration, which accounts for about 50% of all drug arrests. And then we look at where these arrests are made. Is it not perpetuating the cycle of black communities where it began in the 70s, holding them back, and in terms of class and race, if then those people who are now parents didn't have those opportunities, where does that leave their children?
So the cycle, yeah. Thoughts on how do you break that cycle?
So not by what I do, but by being a parent, I speak on this. I have done everything I can as a parent to keep my kids out of the cycle of being arrested, the cycle of being a drug dealer. Now, I'm not saying I've been successful all the time, but one thing that always distressed me, and my kids, again, we're from Carver, Massachusetts. Any of you even know where that is? So look, hardly nobody even knows where it is, but yet my kids were all about New Jack City, and they were watching all the different movies, and that's what they were looking up to, and I didn't get it. And one of my sons actually became and is kind of a social activist, made different films and worked with Smith Academy. He went to Bentley and actually graduated. And one of the things I asked him is, why that? And he goes, because that's what I related to. So I think when we start, just the way I said earlier about I don't think athletes should be heroes. I think that some behaviors, no matter where you are, need to be unacceptable. And that has to be reinforced over and over and over and over again. And I say that as a parent. I always tell my kids, you can be a drug dealer, but you can't live here. You can get high anytime you want when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, but you can't live here. And that might sound corny and whack. Dad, you're whack. You're so whack. But you know what? I want to be whack. because I want I want them to know what I value. And I used to always tell them, you need to try to understand that if what you permit, you promote. And if I permit that stuff, if I think it's okay, then it's going to grow and it's going to fester. So I think when we talk about the call for law and order, I don't talk about law and order. I talk about order. You know, I believe in order. I believe that things should be a certain way, that you should have certain values, that you should value and respect others, that I believe in the privacy of people's own home. I believe in a lot of different things, and I use that as a parent to try to shape my own kids. Now, again, I don't live very far from Brockton, and I didn't grow up very far from Brockton, and I spent a lot of time in Brockton. So I get what you're saying, but I still believe that your values should be shaped by your community and your home. And if we can make some of these things not acceptable behaviors, they'll probably stop.
Now, just when you say shaped by your community or your home, what if that community is largely a drug community where there are a lot of temptations on those people?
So
And then you have people drug laws. Are the drug laws what's causing people to do drugs, or are people simply just because they grow up? Which chicken and egg question?
you know, I have a real simple thought on people who deal drugs. And the thought is that it's easy money, and it's easy money. You don't have to get up in the morning. Nobody's going to tell you that you're late. There's no dress code. You know what I mean? You don't have to call in when you don't want to come. You know, it's cool. It's cool to do it. But again, you know, I think until we look down on that, and it's y'all, young people, and until y'all look down and say, hey, you know what, that's not good. Like, well, they're just selling weed, but that's not really good. Like, that devalues you and a work ethic. I mean, you know, and again, I had to intervene on one of my sons who wanted to be a drug dealer. And I thought it was crazy. I said, this is a guy who has everything but wants to be a drug dealer. You know, and one of the things that we talked about when it was all said and done was, you know, what message do you want to send? It's messaging, you know, I mean, and again, in terms of being an entrepreneur, where's the future in that? I don't know one drug dealer, and I've been doing this, I've been alive 53 years, and I've been working in prison that for almost 30 years that has a 401k or has health insurance, but they have kids, so that means their kids don't have health insurance. So part of what I told my son, don't be selfish. Don't be
Excellent
selfish.
message. Excellent message. One final question, please.
If I just jump in there,
Yep.
I would share
did too.
all of those opinions, but when you use a phrase like a drug community, or that's the values of those communities, that's also a community largely devoid of good paying jobs that used to exist 30 years ago for working class men, black and white. Those are communities in which the city or the state has turned their back on good educational opportunities where teachers want to teach and care. So for me, it's sort of a chicken and the egg thing. Yeah. You're not going to get a lot of personal responsibility when people can't get good jobs, when they don't have licenses to drive to good jobs, when they don't come from good schools, when there's a breakdown in a lot of other things that we could do something to address so that we can cultivate personal responsibility.
So 2 more questions here and then up front, and then we'll stop for a break.
This is more like a comment other than a question. I work for the city of Boston. I work one of the city councilors in District 6 in Jamaica Plain. And one of our biggest, I would say, issue is a lot of our young adults, when they do get out of jail, when they're done with their time, they don't seem to gain a lot of when it comes to the programs that is being offered for those students, for those kids that are in jail. So it would be as, how effective are the programs? How effective is the GED program for those people who are in juvenile courts? Like, what's the percentage of those juvenile that actually end up getting their GED or actually end up doing something better, or are they going back to actually doing bad for the community? Because obviously they're not getting jobs because they're not taking them because of their records. So how effective is it?
Good.
How effective are the programs
How
that
effective
are
are them?
helping the students?
These re-entry programs.
I guess that's directed kind of to me. I'll say this.
And then right up here.
The programs that people involve themselves in, what they get out of them is just like the way you get what you get out of by taking a certain major, or certain classes. It's the application of the person to use the resources that they have. A GED is a GED is a GED. The Massachusetts Department of Corrections is the #1 GED tester and the highest GED passer in the state. The state, more than anybody. We test more. It's not even called GED anymore. It's another high T or some name that we have now. We've changed the name of GED testing. But we're the #1 teacher, tester, and highest level of people who pass. So wherever you get that education, it's fine. Now, how do you apply it? Now, one of the things I tell guys is be realistic. Be realistic. I didn't start out being the assistant deputy commissioner. I started out airing up basketballs and passing out pool sticks in the gym because that's the truth. So be realistic in your expectation of where you're going to go. Second of all, don't be a professional victim. Because you did time doesn't mean that you're a bad person. You might have to sell yourself a little better. You might have to be a little bit more persistent. But I will tell you this, I've dealt with some, and again, we're talking about drug offenders, who could become the best car salesman, and have, who have started their own business. I was at a state building. There's work being done up at Hampden County Jail. And there was a gentleman driving a truck. And there's a big company that I'm looking. And this guy was in jail since he was about 17. 17 years old. He's probably in his 40s now. And he yelled at me, "Hey, Mike." I looked. "Hey, Mike." Came down. He said, "This is my company. We got a state contract. He's African American." He said, "I'm doing well." He said, "You know what I learned? My GED got me into college. My college taught me to have a business, and I'm not a victim."
Outstanding. Last question.
Is this on? Oh,
Yep.
It's partly a question, partly my own concerns as a Southerner. And as a Southerner, I mean one who grew up in inland Florida and southern Georgia and around the Cape and even lived in Ferguson for a while. And I am a little bit personally concerned about some of the implications of the critiques of the book along with some of the ideas inside of the book. I think to myself when I think about class and race, and I wonder, when is the last year I can think of in American history in which those two were not essentially synonymous? And I think maybe 1670. Everything after that, phew. And so part of me thinks that maybe some of the critiques are a little bit disingenuous in when we try to separate class and race. But I'm not going hard on that for a reason. I'm also reminded of the idea of how there is a large mass of poor, and I'm reminded of something that Jim Goad, not everyone likes him, I don't particularly like him, but when I read one of his works, The Redneck Manifesto, he brought up a point to me, which was that every time that wealth became concentrated, the divisions between race amongst the poor classes actually increased. And it makes me wonder if, with some of the critiques, when we try to divide these things, and we try to compartmentalize them, and we try to accept critiques and ideas which I actually think are uniquely un-American, ideas of relations between class and race which seem more actually European-derived to me, that I wonder if we're adopting ideas that sound nicer to us in order to make sense of things, rather than trying to actually understand what's going on.
Okay. So back to we can't divide race and class, and I think we've touched on some of that. Any other thoughts?
I think what we can see here is that we've got a couple of different ways of explaining what's going on. A couple of different ways of explaining poverty, explaining crime. One way is to say with politicians and with scholars that it's about our individual responsibility. We choose to engage in crime and we choose to go to school, so individual responsibility and education is the key from a kind of bottom up, good family values. On the other hand, we have other folks who argue that it's not so much about choices. It's about a constricted world of choices, and that there are certain structures and institutions, a whole bunch of institutions out there that reduce the amount of choices that particularly people of color have. And the explanation there is more of a structural explanation. So we've got these two explanations here that we're debating, that we're trying to figure out. And I think as students and as scholars, we need to think more about this. Is it behavior or is it structure? What's the combination here?
Indeed. We started this conversation talking about the celebration of the Constitution of the United States, again, our 227th anniversary. And it's important to keep in mind that while we celebrate the Constitution for the majesty of the document that it is, that it itself was a flawed document, right? That the Constitution itself that was approved in 1787, it counted minorities as 3/5 of a person. That it would be another 75 years before African Americans get the right to vote, another 100 years before women get the right to vote. And so it's only through having these types of conversations, coming together for these types of forums, where we can really, truly embrace what America has become as a result of that Constitution and the things that we do. So I thank you for coming out today and listening to our panel. Can we give them a round of applause? We're going to have a reception right outside. There should be food.